Okay, good morning everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to have this discussion today with you. My name is Frank Hoffer. I'm working in the Bureau for Workers' Activities at the International Labour Organization. Before that, I was working for the ILO in Moscow, and before that I was working on social policy at the university. Before that I was working for the German trade unions, and before that I was working for a local council and was fired because I was the risk is always if someone comes from another country, he knows very little about your conditions. So please bear with me if you feel, well, he doesn't understand the realities of Cyprus that we're actually talking about. That is a risk, I must admit. What I will try to do is to have a bit of a discussion about some concepts, ideas of wage setting mechanisms which we are confronting in a lot of countries. In particular, we are confronting now in the context of the European Union and the Eurozone and the additional kinds of pressure which we have seen on collective bargaining systems, wage setting systems. I will try to cover a number of main points in this presentation. The first is that I think we should not, even if we look at economic issues, we should not just limit this, but should be clear also what is the social, even the human rights foundations of wage policies. Then what are, I think that's key, what are the economic arguments for wage setting mechanisms. And then I will go a bit in detail about minimum wages, about collective bargaining systems, and try to talk a bit about the challenge these systems face in the currency union and in a country, in a system where you have free mobility of people, in which we already heard in the opening statement, the challenge also that's used for wage dumping, and then the transitional challenge of unification. Now this is the Human Rights Declaration. I think we should not forget this, that everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existing worthy of human dignity, supplemented if necessary with other means of social protection. So the whole idea already in 1948 was that wages cannot just be determined by the market, but that there's a human right of a wage, of a living wage. And if it's a human right, it does not only mean that it's desirable, but that it's an obligation of policies to achieve wage systems which guarantee people having at least a living wage they can feed themselves and their families on, and they can participate in society. We know that this is not the reality in a lot of countries, but I think we have to try to bring this back at the center stage of policy debates. What is the purpose of the economy? What is the purpose of wages? It is to achieve at least that human right. Now, and to achieve this, it's also a question, how do you empower workers in this? That's why the ILO core conventions, Convention 87 and Convention 98, say freedom of association and collective bargaining are enabling rights, which is a precondition that this basic living standards for workers can be achieved. And it's not just about wages, it's also about what kind of person you are at the workplace. It's a question whether you have rights, you have dignity, you have respect, or whether you are just seen as a commodity. And finally, it is to achieve less competition among workers. I mean, the ILO Constitution is saying labor is not a commodity. The idea is that the worker is not a potato, and that you have to make sure that you limit the way employers can use competition and very often desperation of workers to cut wages. Now, if you have a discussion publicly and you say everybody should have a living wage, normally you have very easily consensus. People say, yes, we all agree, people should have a good wage, that's not the problem. But then you get into the, what I would call economic arguments of the debate. And this is a very contested term. I mean, on the left-hand side, the arguments we are bringing over from the trade union labor side is that minimum wage and collective bargaining enable workers to achieve fair distribution of income, protected workers are more motivated, willing to engage for the benefit of the company. Minimum wages and collective bargaining stabilize aggregate demand, and then the economy can grow. And they also, because they set a common wage standard, reward productive and innovative enterprises, which have to pay the same wage and less productive enterprises, and therefore they have an advantage. However, the counter-arguments are always more or less the same. They are nuanced. The counter-arguments are always minimum wage and collective bargaining reduce flexibility, innovation, and competitiveness of enterprises. And because they're not flexible, innovative, and competitive, they have lower productivity, therefore you have lower economic growth and lower income even for those you want to protect with collective bargaining, because your economic performance overall is bad if you don't have the dynamics of the market. And they say, okay, collective bargaining is only for those who have an agreement, and then you have dual labor markets, those are not protected, get far less, so that's unfair. And finally, as a new argument, they say, look, you can't have this anymore in a currency union where you have free movement of people and where you have companies outside of the regular framework of your labor market which can compete. Therefore, I think what in the debate from a labor perspective we have to do is we have to be a bit clearer about what is the relationship between productivity, innovation, competition, flexibility, and what is the role of minimum wages and bargaining. The standard story goes that if you want to increase productivity, which is a precondition for improving in the standard of living, you need to have innovation. In order to have innovation, you need companies to compete against each other, because the competition is the force which drives every entrepreneur to innovate, and by that becomes more productive. And in order to do this, they have to be flexible, that they can hire and fire as they want, because then they can better compete, they will be more innovative, you will have higher productivity, and everybody will be better off. And minimum wages and collective bargaining agreements have a negative influence of flexibility, and therefore there's a problem. That's the standard argument. Now, let's look at the different elements a bit more in detail and think how convincing this argument is. This is a quote from Paul Krugman, where he says that productivity is key, because on the long run, if you're not more productive, you cannot increase the standard of living. However, I think I'm not entirely agreeing with this statement, because this is the country's ability to improve its standard of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise its output per worker. I think that's not exactly what we call productivity, because if you have an 8-hour day, and in a crisis you make workers 10 hours work, their output per worker will follow, but you have no productivity, you have just more exploitation. So the key point I think which is missing is you want to raise the output per worker per hour. You want that workers have more, can use more machinery, have maybe better work organization, and that the productivity per hour grows, because let's be clear, if you don't produce more as a society, there's limits what you can distribute. The second point is there's no automatic mechanism. We have seen in the last years that the growth of productivity translates into growth in living standards. What we've seen in the last 10 years or 20 years is a de-link between productivity growth and the rise of wages. The wage share has been declining, so what we have to keep in mind is, yes, productivity growth is key for raising standards of living, but if you don't have a mechanism which also addresses the distribution issues in society, that does not automatically happen. Now, obviously, if you want to increase productivity and not just by putting more pressure on workers, you need innovation, you need new technology. Now the OECD says that much of the rise in living standards is due to innovation. This has been the case since the Industrial Revolution. That's true. I mean, developing the internet or cars or washing machines, that has all been key innovations for increasing productivity. However, there is quite some interesting literature which enterprises are particularly innovative. And fear is not a good precondition for innovation. If people have always fear, if they don't are secure in their job, they normally don't engage in the same way in a company and in new ideas as if they are constantly fearing to lose their job. So we know that companies who have safer working, more stable working conditions, who have workers' representation, are on average more innovative than other companies. Now comes the interesting point about competition. I mean, you see two pictures of competition because there are different types of competition. There is a competition which is a driver for innovation and productivity, but not necessarily. For example, if you allow wages to go down, someone might also be able to compete by just putting more pressure on his or her employees, by just worsening working conditions, by not investing in health and safety, by not providing the basic security you need at the workplace, and the company becomes more competitive because they're cheaper, but they don't drive for innovation and productivity rise, but just by doing this by either worsening working conditions or maybe polluting the environment. So what we have to think about is, if we think about competition, what type of competition do we want? And basically, the concept would be, you want direct competition to initiatives that really raise innovation and productivity, and not any kind of competition. For example, if you have a company which does not invest in health and safety, then yes, the cost for the company might be cheaper, but the society has to pick up the bill for higher health costs for workers who have to be treated in hospitals, or people have to bear this cost because they get sick, they die earlier. So that kind of competition is neither necessary nor desirable for innovation and productivity. And setting clear standards on the environment, on working conditions, actually is a contribution for directly competition in the right direction. And now we come to flexibility. Is flexibility the way to be competitive? Again, this is a big question, because if you allow companies to shift all the risk of employment to workers, you might provide flexibility which allows companies not to be innovative and not to be competitive in the sense of new ideas, because they can easily reduce wages or fire people without trying to find better solutions running their companies. To give you an example which makes that maybe a bit clearer, perhaps, if two companies take a credit from a bank, they both pay, let's say, 5% interest rates. And after the year, one company was less successful. So they think, okay, I have to be more flexible. Let me go to the bank and say, look, I wasn't as good as my competitor. I think you should agree that I only pay 2.5% interest rates and not 5% interest rates. Well, everybody would say, well, this is against the law of the market. You know, why should the bank subsidize the unsuccessful company by lowering the interest rate? If the same employer, instead of going to the bank, turns to his workers and says, look, I was less successful, you should accept a wage cut that we can stay competitive. Everybody is saying, well, workers should understand that they have to be flexible. So the real logic of the market would be that no, if you can't pay the going price for a product, be it wages or be it interest rates, you have to be improving your business or you have to go bankrupt. And the advantage of, obviously a lot of workers are afraid if their company goes bankrupt, but if you look at the economy as a whole, you want to set rules in the market also for wages, that those companies who are not able to compete under these conditions will go out of the market, and others will have a possibility who are more productive to be developed faster. What we have seen basically is that who bears the brunt of flexibility of competition is very often a constant struggle between the state, employers, and workers. Who bears the risk of this process? And what we have seen in the last years in the flexibility discourse is that more and more the argument is the risk has to be borne by the workers. They have to be flexible, they can't be protected, they cannot have an industry-wide agreement. And I think the whole battle is about reshifting that balance of risk, that part of the risk has to be borne by employers, part has to be by the state. And there will always be a risk also to be workers, because as long as we're the market economy, you will have cyclical unemployment. Now, to sum up, the first part of my presentation is basically that minimum wages and collective bargaining have the function of limiting, shifting, but also intensifying competition by taking labor out of competition within the sector and national economy. If you say this is the going wage rate, all competitors, let's say in the tourist industry, have to pay, so that a roommate in any hotel has to get the same wage, so you get it taken out of competition. You ensure fair distribution, because also if you ensure that you set a basic wage floor, normally you compress the wage structure in the society, and therefore more people in a more equitable way participate in the economic development. I think you stimulate with collective bargaining greater workplace efficiency, because if people get a fair wage, normally you can assume people do also a fair job. And what I said earlier, you force uncompetitive companies to improve or to close their business. Now the challenge is, how do you respond? So people nowadays are saying, yes, you can have this, but you can't have this anymore because we have opened up to the international markets. I come to that in a minute, but before that I just wanted to use a few words about, if you agree, or if you think, okay, we want to have a minimum wage and we want to have collective bargaining, how are these two mechanisms interrelated, and how do I also design them? Now, if you look at the minimum wage, so the first question, what is the purpose of the minimum wage? I mean, the purpose of the minimum wage clearly is that every worker who works earns enough at least to meet his and basic needs, the basic needs of his family. Which raises the question, what is the right level of a minimum wage? Now, you can have two approaches on that. One is you try to define a basket of goods which everybody should have. That's very complicated. And it's an issue of a constant struggle then. Well, this should be in, this should be out, should people be allowed to go to the cinema once a week or twice a month or whatever. In a country with a living standard like Cyprus or a developed economy, it might be much easier to say we try to set the minimum wage as a percentage of the mean or the median wage. So say, look, and I mean the EU basically says that if you earn less than 66% of the median wage, then you have a poverty wage. So the probably simplest way for setting a level is to say it has to be a percentage of what is either the average or the median wage in a society. Now the next question is, should there be one minimum wage or should there be different minimum wages? And I think you can't answer this purely economically. it is more very often a political issue. I mean, the big advantage of one minimum wage is everybody knows that is the minimum in the country. No one can say, oh, this is not, applies not to us, this doesn't apply to others, and so on. But you can also argue on the other hand that you don't want the minimum wage to become maximum wage by then in certain sectors where you average earn more, people suddenly say, look, you are earning so much, let's go down to the minimum wage. So I think that's a bit of the challenge. I understand that in Cyprus today, you basically have two different systems. I understand that in the northern part you have a universal minimum wage, and in the southern part you have sectoral minimum wages. And there's probably a question then, if you want to get step by step to a unified wage system, how you deal with this. But basically, the experience has shown that if you come to a single minimum wage, it's more easy to have a discussion about what's the level of the minimum wage, how do we increase this, and that maybe sectoral minimum wages are then only necessary in areas where you feel that the overall wage level in that sector is higher than what you would expect from the universal minimum wage. The next question is how to set the minimum wage. And there I think it is very important that you think about mechanisms which take it out of the direct possibility of governments to do this only. If you look at the United States of America, whenever the Republicans are in power, the minimum wage is frozen. And if you freeze the minimum wage for 5-8 years, it's dead. Because if you have a certain inflation, if you don't lift up the minimum wage, it loses its function of protecting people. Now you can either have a system where it is done in tripartite negotiations, where you say employers, organizations, trade unions, and governments come together and discuss this. That's done in several countries. The problem is that as a union, sometimes also might, in particular in times of an economic downturn, easily find an alliance of employers and government, which makes it difficult to raise the minimum wage. The other option is like they do it in the UK, that you have a low-paid commission of experts from different fields who make a recommendation, and then normally the government follows that recommendation. Now the point is, by that you take it out of the influence of trade unions, of the organized voice of workers. Another option is what they did in Brazil, is that they said, oh, we negotiate a predictable mechanism how the minimum wage will be increased. And basically what they discussed is that they would increase the minimum wage by the productivity growth in the country plus of the previous year plus the inflation rate. So that you say, look, we have a mechanism, we want that we set the minimum wage at a floor, and we want that also poor workers participate in the overall productivity growth in the industry, and we want that they're protected against inflation, and we agree that is the mechanism for the next, I think they agree for the next 5 years. This will grow, and they added even a little additional component because they said, look, we want to lift up the minimum wage slowly, that we compress the wage structure at the bottom. So I mean, this is different models how you can set this, but our experience from the ILO is that there should be, and that's also what our convention says, a participation of employers and business organizations one way or another in this process. It should not be just left to government or experts. Then finally, that I also said a bit about how to adjust it. You have to make clear, if you said once, that you have a mechanism that says it goes with economic growth. And then what's the impact of a minimum wage? I mean, what a minimum wage does, is that does to a large extent redistribution within the working class. I think also unions have to be clear about this. If you increase, let's say, the wages of hairdressers. So these part of the workers earn more, but you could assume that this will lead probably to higher cost for a haircut. So those of us who go to the hairdresser and pay for the haircut will have, if you want, a reduction in their real wages, because you have to spend more for the haircut, you can't spend on other things. So what you have is, if you lift wages, if you compress the wage structure, some workers will have a better wage, and some will also have basically higher costs. I mean, in the good old days, we used to call that solidarity. We were just saying that we want to have a wage system where we have a more inclusive wage system. But I think we have to be clear about it. To give you just an example, in a country like Brazil, 12% of the female workforce are domestic workers. Why is that possible? Because the rich are so rich, the poor are so poor that the rich can have lots of domestic workers. In a country like Sweden, I think 0.2% of the female workforce are domestic workers. Why? Because the wage differentials are so little that most people decide that they have to clean their houses themselves, because otherwise it's too expensive. What you have on the other hand is, in a country like Sweden, you have changed a lot of work which is done by domestic workers to public services. That's available to everyone. But I mean, that's what you want to achieve basically by compressing the wage structure. Then you have a fairer distribution also among the workers, and not. And I think it would be an illusion to assume that just we push up minimum wages and just reduces profits of capital and all the other workers are not affected by it. I think we should be clear about this. Now, let me come to collective bargaining. I mean, the little picture is, you know, how we always think it should be. There's an antagonistic relationship between workers and employers, there's protest, and there's certain laws, and in the end there's a collective bargaining agreement. Now, the question is, at what level do you set collective bargaining agreements? If you set it at the enterprise level, yes, it limits the individual competition among workers in that enterprise. Every worker knows there's a collective agreement, I'm this and this category, and that is the kind of wages I'm supposed to get. But if collective bargaining is limited to the enterprise, you don't do anything that not one enterprise is trying to reduce the wages for their workers in order to compete to others. Therefore, you might have a much better outcome if you are able to have a sectoral agreement to say, look, in a certain sector, as I said, in the tourist sector, that's the going wage rate for a waiter or for a roommate or whatever, to avoid that one company, the hotel, can turn to the workers and say, look, you have to accept lower wages for the others. However, this requires either a strength of the union, that they can organize all the hotels, or it requires a mechanism that a sectoral agreement becomes binding for the whole industry. Now, the third thing is you can have regional agreements. I think and that's probably something also in a process of unification which needs to be discussed. If you have regions which have a very different level of productivity, a very different level of costs, you might want to say that we accept this and therefore we will limit the collective agreement to a certain region. And this is even for public sector areas. You might also think sometimes that there's a difference of cost of living in the capital and other places. And then you can have a national collective bargaining agreement, like we have basically in countries like Belgium, you know, where basically they at the national level fix the overall wage increase, which has the great advantage that everybody in this society participates directly in the productivity growth in the economy. Because otherwise, I mean, you would say, let's say, teachers or nurses, I mean, they don't have increase in productivity, you know. They were teaching 20 kids 50 years ago, they're teaching 20 kids now. So if you want to have them participate in productivity, you probably need a better national wage setting system. Now this is what we know. If you want to achieve greater coverage, you need to have collective bargaining beyond the enterprise. There's no example in the world that unions are strong enough, if they only bargain at enterprise level, to get huge coverage. There are two ways you can extend the coverage. One is you have strong workers and employers organizations, and therefore you get extension, voluntary agreed, and it sticks. Or you have governments who extend collective bargaining coverage to the whole sector by law. And you can see, if you look, I mean, I'll looked at the table, and I must admit that for some reasons there are lots of countries, but I think Cyprus is not on the list. I don't know where you are on this scale, but if you look at France, France has, for example, a system where you have enterprise collective bargaining, you have a bit of voluntary extension, but then the government basically makes it binding for most of the industry. And that is a way where you can have probably a fairly effective wage policy, where wages then can grow in line with national productivity. Let's also be clear, if unions want to do wage policies, you have to have influence on setting the wages at a sectoral and national level. If you only negotiate with enterprise level, just you don't have the instruments to do wage policies. Now let me come to the point. Well, people would say it's all desirable with the kind of extended function of collective bargaining, so but we can't do this anymore in a currency union because, well, we set nationally a wage, but then companies who are in other parts of Europe, they are not bound by this. They become more, they get cheaper and they become more competitive, and then we lose market share and we will have deficit. So we have to accept that we can no longer set national wage policies in a currency union, but we have to accept that now it is the market who determines this, and therefore collective bargaining has to be decentralized to the enterprise level. That's basically the story of the Troika. That's basically the suggestion that comes from what I would say the economic mainstream discussion. Now, the argument is, well, in the past you could have a national wage policy, and if you were not sufficiently competitive, you could devalue your currency, and then you are competitive again. And with the devaluation of the currency, you basically try to put a tax on everybody. You lower the living standards because imports become more expensive. But your export industry, but because you become competitive again, the market mechanism will realize that then those industries which with the lower exchange rate are competitive again will grow, and you have a balanced trade balance. Now the argument is that if you can't do this, then you have to do the so-called internal devaluation, you have to cut the wages. Again, it assumes that you can do that the adjustment goes through a wage process and not to any other attempts of developing industries, industrial policies or whatever, but that you leave all that to the market. Now, if you do a currency unions, ideally, you probably have to have a commitment by all participants that they have a coordinated wage policy. If you don't want to have these balances, you would have to have a wage policy where you said all countries you agree our wages should grow in line with productivity and with the target inflation rate of the European Central Bank. Now, there are those who've done this has basically been in the last 15 years France. France had a wage policy which had this kind of functional wage policy very much in line with national productivity. But it doesn't help them if Germany pursues an aggressive back-of-the-labor policy by cutting their wages, increasing their exports, and by that creating a huge balance from the bottom. And on the other hand, countries who ignore basically the fact that they are in the currency union and say, look, we will increase wages higher than productivity level, will become deficit countries and will face the problems we all know. Now the question for me was, if you have a small country like Cyprus, what are the options you have in the situation if you once joined the currency union, in the way if you want to do wage policies? Now the first option is you ignore the realities of the currency union, the growing trade deficit and the declining competitiveness. I think that's what some countries did. They thought we can ignore this, okay, the deficit is going up, we are one currency, it goes on, it will not cause problems. Well, this hit the wall during the crisis. Now the second option is that, okay, this is what comes from the Troika, we participate in the race to the bottom. You deregulate your labor market to put the pressure on the workers, you do the internal devaluation, and by that you regain competitiveness. We've seen that that also doesn't work because you create such a kind of depression in these economies, aggregate demand goes down, that you basically seems to be stuck in a situation of permanent crisis. Now, if that's basically two problems, if you have, I would say, uncontrolled currency union, then you have to think what are other options. Well, one option is if you see that you lose your competitiveness, that we're using tax policies to reduce non-wage costs and increase the cost for inputs. I mean, it's an amazing thing what Germany did, even when they already had a trade deficit in the early 2000s. They increased their VAT and they reduced their contributions to the unemployment insurance. So what was the mechanism? So if you increase your VAT by, let's say, I think it was 2%, all imports from other competitors become 2% more expensive. But your companies have 2% less wage bill because you're taking the income from the VAT to reduce their costs on unemployment insurance. So you give them a cost advantage of 2%, and also their input exports become cheaper because the wage costs go down and they don't pay VAT on exports. Not surprisingly, it was an additional driver to increase massively Germany's trade surplus. What I'm saying is, you might have to think about ways, how do I ensure through tax policies that if my wages grow faster than the rest of the currency union, that I don't lose competitiveness. Now the other option is, obviously, you say the currency option union is so uneven, it cannot function if we don't have a system of transfers. Now there are two systems of transfers. One is you agree on the transfers like you do in a country. In a country, you know, if one area has high unemployment, another area has low unemployment, like, I mean, as I've come from Germany, Bavaria has low unemployment, Bremen has high unemployment, but you have one unemployment insurance, and through that you have transfers. Or you have transfers through prices. That's the way the EU has chosen, like I see it at the moment. You have the prices, you have then indebtedness and default and cuts, and that's highly disruptive. But it's also a transfer system. That's what I never get in the discussions. Also, that is a transfer system. It's just a very dysfunctional. Or what you can do, if you can't agree on the European level, you can think about having a tax policy in your own country which avoids wrong wage development. You could, for example, say there's a progressive tax on wages which grow faster than productivity, and there's a progressive tax on profits in companies which are based on wages growing below productivity. That has been, at least the first part has been tested in Poland in the 90s. It can work, but it is obviously a huge political battle if you want to have a penalty tax on excessive profits based on lowering wages. Now, what I think with Cyprus is, I mean, you have gone through the crisis, you know all your problems, but I think you face an additional problem that you will have to integrate a part of your economy into this currency union, which hasn't been the currency union before, if I understand it right. So that will probably mean that you will have to think a lot about what kind of wage policies you can introduce in that process that avoids that you have a massive wage shock in the newly integrated area. Now, I think actually in a small economy, it might be not such a good way to think in the lines I just presented earlier about using the kind of macroeconomic wage policies for stabilizing your economy, but rather trying to look at the key sectors you have in the economy, and if there are wage developments which are dissatisfactory, addressing them directly through industrial and structural policies. So the question I think you would have to look at is whether wage is a competitive factor for the big financial sector in your country. Now, I would guess it's not. I would guess the reasons why you have a financial sector which is competitive has very little to do with the wages which are paid in the financial sector. I think that has a lot to do with the tax system you have, the preferences, the ways you have, and so I think the question of competitiveness is rather whether you want to have a system which allows such a big financial sector with a huge volatility and risk. With the tourist sector, I think this is another question which I don't know. Is it that Cyprus is in a price competition with other areas in the Mediterranean, like let's say Turkey or Greece, or are there other factors which determine whether tourists come to Cyprus or not? I mean, let's be clear. I mean, Turkey, Cyprus, Greece all benefit from the turmoil in Northern Africa because people don't want to go for their vacations where they're afraid of chaos, terrorism, or whatever. And there might be other factors which are much more important than price competition to make Cyprus as a tourist destination more attractive. And I think that would be a discussion where unions can engage and say, look, if we want to grow that sector, if we want to increase wages, better working conditions, we will not win this through price competition, but we will have to look at other factors to develop the sector. Now the big challenge I heard in the morning is also, what do you do in an EU context if employers try to undercut wages by importing cheap labor? And you might face this also if you open up the borders between the two parts of Cyprus, that there is a low wage pressure from the sectors, from the part where wages are lower now. I think the key question here is that you need to have accompanying measures if you want to have free movement of people. What you need is basically an understanding, yes, we want the free movement of people, yes, we want that our people, if they want, can work in other countries, and if other people from other countries in the EU come want to work in our countries, that should be possible, but there should be accompanying measures. The accompanying measures should make sure that whatever are the wage standards of workers in this country apply to everybody who comes in. And for that, I think the key element is to have a meaningful minimum wage and have the extension of collective bargaining agreements. And that is probably the biggest challenge, I would think, for the wage setting mechanism in Cyprus, whether you can get an extended collective bargaining mechanism or wage setting mechanism for the tourist industry. I don't know so much about the other industries. Now let me finish by coming to a few ideas about the question of unification and wage setting mechanisms. When I prepared for this, obviously, as I said, being German, I thought a lot about the German unification process. And I think concerning wages, you are in a much better position than Germany was when they did the unification. Because there seems to be, the gap seems not to be as big as between the two parts of Germany. There is already much more similar systems of the economy in place. There's also maybe much more knowledge about how wage setting is in the different countries, and also there is already a certain labor market flexibility. But I mean, you have to look, if you have different levels of productivity in the two sectors, two parts of the country, if you have different wage levels and you open up the markets, the first question is, how big is the capital mobility and how big is the labor mobility? So capital mobility, to stay in the tourist sector, there might be a lot of hotels who think, okay, if I now go to the northern part and build hotels there, labor is cheaper, you know, beaches are the same, or I don't know whether beaches are nice or not. Let's say beaches are the same. So you might have a lot of investment going in the northern part because wages are lower there. That's the one question you have to look at, and what would that mean for other sectors? The other sector is, there might be an idea to say, look, can we bring in a lot of workers from the north to work in the hotel industry in the south because they're cheaper? You know, is that a risk or not, and how do you deal with that? Also, so one element would be, okay, let's raise the wages in the area where the wages are now lower, but that could be a massive economic shock. I mean, that's what they did in the German unification. They overnight increased the wages in East Germany by 50–60%, and not surprisingly, a lot of the enterprises went to the wall, went bankrupt, and lost a lot of jobs. So there might be a need to say, look, if we raise wages because we don't want so much migration in our country that people from the north go to the south because they feel forced to it, then you have to think, what is a credible mechanism to bring these wages up to that level over a certain period of time? And there might be even a need, and that's the question, how big is the, let's say, the desire of people in the north to move to the south? I have no ideas about this, because in East Germany the desire was incredibly high. They lost basically 10 to 15% of their workforce moved to West Germany, which had the double effect that a lot of good and skilled people left East Germany, and there was a lot of pressure on the labor market in West Germany. So you have to have an understanding how big is the mobility pressure, and if it is, how can wage policy be predictable, how you can, over a certain period of time, to bring these wages together. Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, is the main points I think you have to think about by doing this. If you have two different levels of minimum wages, I think that would be probably the easiest starting point to say, we need to have a mechanism over, let's say, a certain period of time that we get to a uniform basic minimum wage, and that's what everybody gets in Cyprus. Because that also gives people certain clarity how we will adjust the wage levels, and it will also help to put the pressure on the sectors where you have low wages in a way to increase their productivity, and they know also predictably we have to improve this within a couple of years, otherwise we can no longer employ people. And the final question is, I think, do you have the institutions for doing wage policies? So, do you have a legal minimum wage? Can you have an agreement to say, look, in part of our unification national negotiations, we have an idea how we come to a same level of minimum wages? Do you have other standards which reduce competition in the labor market, working time, working conditions? Is there a kind of legal framework which can easily be extended? Do you have a social security system that can absorb shocks? Obviously, if you have a social security system, I think the first step for getting a more equitable development would be to extend unemployment and health insurance to the whole country. Because that is something that we don't have to battle about kinds of transfers and compensation all the time. Those who hit the stronger shock would at least get transfers through the unemployment insurance, and also the health insurance would mean that wherever you're living, you're covered with the same health cost that is shared in a solidaristic manner. That reduces massively the kind of economic shock you might have in a certain region. Again, that has been probably the biggest transfer vehicle also in the German unification has been the social security system. Then the question about sectoral bargaining agreements, I think if you want to do wage policies, if you want to influence the flows, you need to have sectoral agreements at least, or you need a willingness for at least a transition period of governments to say, yes, this is a way that we avoid the race to the bottom, too strong labor market shocks. We are willing to consider that if you have a certain threshold of workers organized, if you have a certain level of hotels covered, that is extended to all. That's a legal extension mechanism. But at the end of the day, it will all depend on the trade union bargaining power, role as in power. And that's obviously, if you have economic shocks, as you know better than me, it has a negative effect on trade union bargaining power. And what you need is, on the one hand, I mean, this is the whole thing, so you need to make the argument in society why this kind of wage policy might help to bring the country together, and you need to organize and get the people believing in this process, and that is a challenge. No advice and no expert can do anything about it. It's always the things that you need themselves, I think, when they trust and support of the workers. So finally, what can be done? I think free movement of workers is politically central for a unification process. I think one thing what we want is, we are one country, we can move all in the country where we want. This is an achievement of the unification process. You can only, wage policies will not solve the issue on its own if you cannot bring this together with other policies which I would call public investment, special investment incentives in poor regions that you said, okay, there where we think the unification will create economic shocks, we compensate that, we try to do some investment there. Then I think you have to take into account the differences of productivity in different areas, but you have to have a time horizon when you want to reduce this. That people feel, I'm not the poor cousin in this country is forever, but we will come to a unified labor market. And as I said, I think a joint social insurance system would be key. Okay, sorry, I think I took a little longer than was foreseen, but it's always if you have to slide on my own case, but that's what I have to say. Thank you.